Okej, dobry dzień. Dobra pożelować na seminar, na webinar. Меня зовут Rob, and as usual, we'll continue in English. I hope that's okay. Welcome. Thanks very much for joining us today. It's great to be with you, and thanks to the wonders of the World Wide Web. We're all in different places today, but taking part in the same thing. This webinar is going to focus on some aspects of teaching adult learners. But as ever with my webinars and workshops, some of the ideas will be transferable to other age groups. So you may be able to take some of these and adapt them to whatever needs you may have. So just a couple of words to start with, introductory words that is. My name, as I say, is Rob. You can now play Spot the Difference. That's a picture taken of me in Saratov a few years ago. I'm a teacher, an independent consultant and a teacher trainer. I've been doing this for well over 24 years now, and I've taught all sorts of different ages and different levels. So everything really from primary through to old age pensioners and everything in between. So I'm talking to you today from a city in Poland, a city called Wrocław, which is down there in the southwest. Not too far from Dresden, not too far from Prague, and today the weather is extremely hot and sunny. It's about 33 degrees already, even though here it's only 11 in the morning. In case you're wondering, Wrocław's a beautiful old city. That's a view of the city centre, the old town hall, and it's becoming an increasingly popular tourist destination. So if ever you're thinking of coming to Poland, don't forget Wrocław. Question for you, where are you from? Whereabouts are you today? If you could type in the text chat and let me know where you are, that would be interesting. Krasnodar, hello. I was in Krasnodar, Anna, a few years ago. What a beautiful city. I had a great time there. I hope to come back one day. So we've got Krasnodar. Anywhere else? Anybody from anywhere else? Do type in the text chat where you come from if you'd like to let me know. I know we usually have people from Moscow, Moscow region. Okay, Anastasia, welcome. Anybody from St. Petersburg? Oh, Taliati. I know Taliati. I've been there as well. It's the home of one of the biggest car factories in the world. I happen to remember that. Quite impressive, in a beautiful part of the world. Excellent. So, okay, and the Samara region. Okay, so we're spread around the place, but as I said before, that need not matter because we are in fact all together today. Now, this webinar, I'm going to make it as interactive as I possibly can. Obviously, it's not going to be the same as if we were all sitting together in the same room, but there will be things for you to do so that you don't have to get too bored in the next 60 minutes. Please do stay around till the very end, because at the end there is going to be a raffle with a prize, so there's an incentive for you to stay till the very end. All right, so what I'd like to do to start with today is share with you some pictures. 4 pictures. They all have something in common. We have a shop assistant, we have a waiter, we have a car cleaner, and we have a market research interviewer. Now, I have a question for you. Which one do you think is the odd one out? Now, you don't have to write the whole word. So number 1 for shop assistant, number 2 for waiter, number 3 for car cleaner, number 4 for market research interviewer. Just write the number. Which one do you think is the odd one out? Number 3 from Anna. Any other suggestions? Number 4 from Anastasia. Okay, I've obviously made this rather difficult. All right, well, it's for a very personal reason, actually. Number 4 again gets another vote from Anna. I've made this very personal, and the reason, in fact, that number 3 is the odd one out is that in my own working life, I have at some stage or another been a shop assistant, I have been a waiter, and I have been a market research interviewer, but I have never ever been a car cleaner. And if you see my car today, you'll realise that that tradition continues. It's commonplace, I think, in most countries around the world for students at university age to take part-time jobs to supplement their income. And these jobs were jobs that I took in my student days. But of course, it was never my ambition in the long term to be any of these things. My ambitions lie elsewhere. And when I finished university in 1986, I had a very different idea as to what I wanted to do. So another little interactive activity for you. The way I do this in class actually is we play a game of 20 questions. I'd like you to try and guess in a moment what my job was going to be when I was leaving university. I can only answer yes or no. Now, just before we start, with the students, what I ask them to do is ask questions. We do this verbally. So they ask questions about the job. Now, it will take a very long time on the webinar to do that. So what I'll do is I'll give you some clues and see if you can guess the job. So the clues are this. The job would have involved traveling. The job would have involved working with technology. The job would have involved wearing a uniform. So those are 3 clues for you. What do you think my dream job was when I was leaving university? The other clue I'll give you is it was nothing to do with teaching. So if you think you know, pop it into the text chat. Okay, Anastasia says a flight attendant. Anna says a pilot. Anna says a travel agent. Okay, well, one of you has got it absolutely right. Okay, Anna, pilot is the correct answer. Obviously, in class, that activity would last longer as the students ask questions about the job before actually guessing it. Yes, I wanted to be a pilot, and I went ahead with the original application procedure, but unfortunately, I didn't get anywhere. Why? You might be wondering. Well, it's all about eyesight. As you can see, I wear glasses, and whilst some pilots can wear glasses, my eyesight is not good enough, even with or without. So I had to think again, and of course I ended up doing something totally different. So obviously, since 1986, and thanks for joining in with that, since 1986, lots of things have changed. There's been lots of changes. For a start, relating to the jobs we had on the screen a moment ago, online retail in the UK has grown to be 15.6% of the total. People are shopping online much more than they used to do. So maybe there's a smaller demand now for shop assistants, and I'm sure this is the same in many countries. Market research, the sort I did, used to involve walking up to people with a clipboard and asking them questions and writing their answers down. But this face-to-face market research now accounts for only 54%. It used to be 82%. So we've actually got a lot now done online. Relating to cars, the top 60 car brands in the world are now under the control of only 14 different companies. We mentioned Tagliati, we mentioned the factory there, which is of course Lada. Lada now is under the control of Renault, I understand. A lot of the British companies like Bentley. Bentley's under the control of Volkswagen. BMW own Rolls-Royce. Land Rover and Range Rover and Jaguar owned by Tata of India. So lots of change in terms of business. And a rather whimsical, a rather unusual statistic comes from the world of food. And that is that it is now possible to print your own pizza using 3D printing technology. That's amazing. It sounds very messy, I have to say, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to phone up to have a pizza delivered. So since 1986, lots of change in your life, lots of change in my life, lots of change in the world around us. The world is becoming globalized. The world is becoming digital. The world is moving online. But when we're faced with such changes, I think it's always nice to think about what isn't changing. Some things will continue as they are. And according to Business Insider, a few situations where change is unlikely to occur concerns language. English, it is said, is likely to continue as the world's #1 language. Now, it's true that perhaps there are more people speaking Chinese languages as a first language, but those languages are not used in a massive way beyond the borders or the communities of the Chinese. There are 2 billion speakers of English globally, but only 400 million of those are first language users. That's interesting. So almost or more than 3/4 of English is used by second or third language users. Another thing that will not change, as far as I'm concerned, is that people will still need to communicate for business and pleasure. We're traveling more. We're traveling thanks to cheap airlines. We're leaving our own countries and visiting other places. We're also traveling online. We're traveling virtually. We're communicating through the internet. Most communication today is between second language users of English, which is a very interesting thing, isn't it? So we're less likely than ever to be communicating with so-called native speakers. We're far more likely to be communicating with people whose second or third language is English. Of course, cultural communication is still there, and this is an important part of communicating. Awareness of different cultures can have profound effects, positive effects on the way we communicate. For example, I remember the first time I went to the Middle East. I arrived at the airport in Muscat in Oman, and the young lady at the passport control was eating some kind of sandwich or something, and it looked absolutely delicious. And I said to her, "Oh, wow, that looks very nice. Bon appetit." And she said, "Oh, you must have." And I thought, oh my goodness, I've made a big mistake there. What was the mistake? The mistake was I had complimented the food that she was eating, and therefore she thought that I was asking for it. So this is an example of cross-cultural communication when it might go wrong. So we need to make sure it goes right. So the conclusion here I would suggest is that we need to be preparing our current day learners for a successful future. And that future might be quite a different future from our past. We can guess to a large extent what our students' needs are going to be, but obviously as the world continues to change, we may still be a little unsure of what that will be exactly. But we're going to take an extremely good guess, whatever happens. So let's move on. How are we going to do this? Well, let's have a look at some skills that might just be useful for our learners in our classrooms today. I've put there 8 different skills, 8 different abilities. Now let's categorize them. Let's move them around a little bit to make some sense of this. And as you can see, I've arranged them in terms of what appear on the right to be language skills. But for today, what I'm calling these are hard skills. I don't mean hard in the sense of difficult. I mean hard in the sense of measurable, in the sense of testable, in the sense of teachable. These are the sort of skills that you can shout about in an interview to help you get a job. You can show a certificate to say, I have B2 level of English, for example. Now the other skills, I'm calling these today soft skills. These skills are more connected with emotional intelligence, and they're much more difficult to measure. They tend to be less teachable, but there's nothing to stop us developing them. These are the sort of skills we could actually lie about in interviews, to be honest. You know, we can say, oh yes, I have excellent cultural awareness. There is no such thing as a certificate at B2 level in cultural awareness. So how can the interviewer know whether we're telling the truth or not? So this session then is going to have a look at the use of soft skills in conjunction with hard skills, and look at ways in which we might develop these hand in hand together as we prepare our students for their future. So a quick look at the agenda then. We're going to be focusing firmly on the 21st century adult classroom. We're going to be having a look at some approaches, and along the way we'll be considering elements of motivation, elements of learner autonomy, elements of student-led, elements of teacher-led. There'll be some activities as well. I'll ask you to join in with these to the best of our abilities. I'd like to share with you also some materials, some new Pearson material you may well be very interested in. And as I said, we'll be looking at ways in which we can integrate the hard and the soft skills together in our goal of communication. Now, before we get into the practical stuff, let's have a little look at communication itself. Communication these days is the center of what we're doing in our classrooms. We are aiming to equip students with the abilities to do a number of different things within the realm of communication. So what are those things? Let's see if we can work them out. So this is a little activity for you. I've jumbled up the letters. So the first reason we might communicate is to give and find out. What do you think? Quickly bob it in the text chat if you can work it out. Information, well done. Okay, and the next one, sharing. Who's fast at typing? Well done, thank you very much, Anastasia. Opinions, okay. Solving. Problems, brilliant. We've some very fast typists in Russia, I'm impressed. Okay, here's another one, a little more difficult because there's no collocation here. Begins with S. In fact, I'll tell you what it is. Survival. This can work on several levels, giving people advice to do something that will not harm them. So don't put your fingers in the electrical socket, it's dangerous. Or asking for help if we feel like we're in danger. Or in a company situation, survival of a company. That's a more broad aspect of survival. And then finally, and very importantly, developing and maintaining Stephrelanios. It sounds Greek to me, but it isn't. What do you think this one is? Anybody got it? It's relationships. Relationships. Now, there's a good reason I gave you those all jumbled up, and I'll come back to those a little bit later on. My argument, though, is that if these are reasons for using communication out there in everyday life, perhaps we should be preparing our students for this whilst they are in the classroom. So what are they going to need if they're going to do this? Well, quite clearly, they're going to need a goal, a reason. So for example, taking this is from a course, it's a new course, it's called Business Partner, and I'm going to be mentioning this in the session today. The heading of the unit, the right person. Here is our goal. Our goal is to describe a job. What do we need in order to be able to do that? Well, we need some grammar and we need some vocabulary. We also need an opportunity for students to show that this goal has been achieved. So if we go right to the very end of the lesson, there we are. We've got the final activity where the students have to describe a job to the group and the others have to guess what the job is. It's based on this principle. If you aim at nothing, you will hit it. I remember in my early days of teaching, I used to open the book and start with exercise 1, then move to exercise 2, then move to exercise 3. And sometimes it was a bit of a surprise where it all went. These days, I think it's so important to look at the last activity in a lesson to find out where it is that we're actually going. And a modern course nowadays, of course, will tell us with these headings at the beginning of the lesson what it is we're aiming to do. So if this is our goal, how are we going to get there? Well, let's start off with some vocab. And I'm doing this on purpose because in the words of David Wilkins, without grammar, little can be achieved. Without vocabulary, though, nothing can be achieved. So this explains why in so many course books, the vocabulary section comes first. And I like this quote because I've found this myself many, many times. I've traveled around Russia many times. I've been to many different places. I don't know any Russian grammar, but I do know some Russian vocabulary. And Russian vocabulary has allowed me to get coffee, to check into a hotel, to buy a ticket. I haven't had the grammar, but I've achieved results through vocabulary. Now, obviously, we do want our students to use grammar. That will come. And I'm not saying it's unimportant. So let's have a little look at some vocabulary. Very, very graphic here. We've got some jobs. I'll give you the names of the jobs actually, just to make it a bit easier. We've got an accountant, an estate agent, a vet, a lawyer, a PA, a plumber, and a receptionist. Okay, a little activity here we could do with the students is to get them to memorize these. So what I'd like you to do is just look at them for 10 seconds or so. Don't write anything down. And I'd like to try and remember those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 jobs. Can you do that? 10 seconds starts now. Okay, that was 10 seconds. Now, what I could ask you to do next, but don't worry, I won't. I could ask you to work together in groups and try and memorize them. Either write them down or just speak together as to what the 7 activities, the 7 jobs were. Now, in the webinar, it's not easy to do that, so I'm not going to ask you. But here's another way we could actually work with this activity. You'll see that 3 of them are still hidden. So B was estate agent, C was vet. What was G? If you think you can remember, just type it into the text chat. Straight away, again, some very fast typing from Anna and Anna. Receptionist is exactly correct. Now, I'm doing this using the computer, obviously. In class, we don't have to do it this way. These pieces of material actually feature in the back of the book. So using something like the vocabulary bank, this is designed to complement the unit pages. What the students can do is work together in pairs to challenge one another. So in the first activity, one student closes the book, the other student keeps the book open, and the one with the open book quizzes the others as to what the pictures were. The one we just did with some of them hidden can be done in a visual way by covering certain pictures using, for example, scraps of paper or post-it notes. So the vocabulary bank also, as you can see, contains certain other activities. We've got describing jobs, and we've also got jobs, should I say, activity number 3, if you look. It says work in pairs and discuss. These are open questions. There are no right or wrong answers to these. So an important way of ensuring that everybody is engaged and happy is to give different kinds of questions. Closed questions where there is only one correct answer, or open questions where in fact everybody can have an opinion and everybody can be right according to their opinion. So we had a game-like activity, in fact, with the quizzing, the memory, the little pictures. Here's another one. I'd like you in a moment to take part in this. We're going to do this as a race, okay? I'm going to ask you in a second to type into the text chat 4 different jobs, okay? A job that's dangerous, a job involving traveling, a job where you work alone, and a job where you wear a uniform. We're going to do this as a race. Are you ready? 4 different jobs starting from now. Takes a moment for you to type. It's okay, I'm still here in case you can hear silence and nothing else. Brilliant, Anastasia, you're fast. I'm very impressed. So we've got sportsman, pilot, plumber, and worker. Brilliant. Oh, and sorry, Anastasia, I know you had fireman, pilot, programmer, and waiter. Electrician, pilot, accountant, police. Fantastic. Okay, this little activity, incidentally, is an adaptation. It's an adaptation of a game I used to play with young children. You can make this more challenging, in fact. I could have been cruel and asked you to come up with 4 jobs, all beginning with the same letter. That makes it a bit more challenging. We could have a pronunciation focus here. I could ask you to think of 4 jobs, one containing the sound E, one containing the sound A, one containing the sound R, and one containing the sound OO, for example. So lots of adaptation, lots of possibilities, and lots of games. But do you play games in the classroom with adults? Well, I do, most certainly. I think games in the classroom provide natural opportunities for repetition. Thinking about this, guessing games, students are often repeating things over and over again without realizing it. In games where we're using dice or counters, meta language such as pass the dice, it's my turn, it's your turn, I'm winning, you're cheating. These sort of expressions can be repeated over and over again without the students actually realizing that they're repeating the language, but as they do so, they internalize it. They also develop strategy and critical thinking skills. Everybody wants to win. How do we do it? We need to think about it. And games have a connection to what we do in our everyday lives for fun. So there's a motivational aspect here. And I did mention this earlier on, that using motivation as a key factor in our teaching, games, personalization, getting students to think, getting students to actually take the role of being in charge of an activity, for example, quizzing each other about the pictures, all aspects of motivation. And of course, the games are all about contributing to linguistic aims of the session. Just one final one here, this I particularly like. Again, what this does is recycle and reinforce aspects of language at the same time as making it personal. It's an open task, so getting students to mark on the line with a cross how much they agree or disagree, then they can get together and share their feelings. Let's move on to a bit of grammar, and I'd like to go back in time here, talking about grammar as it used to be, going back into the 1960s and 70s. I remember when I was at school, grammar was always the worst part of dealing with foreign language. And for good reason, because the way it was done was not always particularly interesting. If we take this piece of material, this is a grammar reference book published in the 1960s, and we're doing here present simple with question and answer. Object questions. Is this a tree? Yes, this is a tree. Is this a ship? Yes, it is. Pretty boring, I'm sure you're going to agree. Moving on, it gets strange. Is this a ship? No, it's not a ship. It's a cigarette. We don't use cigarettes nowadays, do we, in course materials? But the final one is the most ridiculous thing I think I've ever seen in a course book. It says, is this a cigarette? No, it's not a cigarette. It's a horse. I mean, I've never confused the two. Talk about meaningless. 21st century grammar then is something different. First of all, we need a context that is real and relevant. We use language, including grammar, as we said, to communicate. So let's do just that. In this particular piece of material, we have an audio in which students are discussing looking for a job. The audio contains in situ the target grammar. A job which, someone who, and someone that. So we can see here we're dealing with the relative clauses. So once we've done the comprehension questions, we can then use this as a database, if you like, to pull out the language and analyze it. But who does that? Now, in the old days, the teacher may give a lecture, but that's not a particularly memorable or effective way of doing it. What is effective is to get the students involved. How can we do that? Well, if we look at this piece of material, we have the rule box, okay? Use defining relative clauses to give more information about people and things. And the students actually have to think about this. We use who for people or things. So the students go back to the text, they look at the examples, they check it out, and they come to the conclusions. It's based upon the principle, tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I, what is it, beginning with L. See who's first in the text chat. Okay, we've got know is good, yeah. I've got learn actually, but same difference, excellent. Now, just to be clear here, some students stress out about this. Particularly students who may have had a more traditional learning experience where they're used to the lecture from the teacher. They may say, well, you're the teacher, you tell me. Well, there are different ways of working with this kind of material, this inductive approach. The stronger students could do the task we've just seen on the screen. Less confident students could go to the grammar reference, read it through, and then do the material on the screen. So it's basically hand in hand between the inductive approach in the pages of the book and the grammar reference in the back of the book, the two working hand in hand. Of course, it doesn't mean to say the teacher has to abdicate responsibility here. It's still up to us to make sure that they have actually got the rules. And this is where practice comes in. We've heard the expression, practice makes perfect. Don't practice till you get it right. Practice until you can't get it wrong. Well, I quite like the idea, to be honest, and this might sound strange, of getting it wrong occasionally. We learn from our mistakes. Some of you may have heard of John Hattie, the Australian educationalist, and he said that learning a language is a little bit like a little baby making learning steps, learning to walk. When a little baby falls over, we don't say to the baby, "You did that wrong, now do it again." And in the same way, perhaps we shouldn't be saying that to our learners when they're making mistakes with their language practice. So giving them ample practice to show improvement and learning steps is key. But what sort of practice? Well, common coursebook practice activities have involved things like gap filling, sentence completion, putting words in order, transformations, forming opposites, forming negatives, all these mechanical things we're probably very, very familiar with from the pages of the course books we've used. Stuff like this, for example, practicing here, make or do. How much money does a waitress make? Could you do the washing today? Did Tom's new business make a profit last year? Has Dick done the washing up? Were you doing your homework when I called? I'm struggling with it myself here. Now these are all very well, they're very mechanical, but they have no meaning. How much money does a waitress make? I don't know. And do I care? No, I don't. Unless that is my wife or sister or close family friend who was a waitress. Could you do the washing today? That's a strange thing to ask a student. Did Tom's new business make a profit? Well, who's Tom? Does he exist? I don't think he does. So how could his business have made a profit if Tom doesn't exist? These are further examples of what I'm calling meaningless practice. It's mechanical, it's not connected to the individual. It doesn't really help our learners to communicate in those categories we mentioned earlier about themselves. What does? Well, more up-to-date approaches to practice, using creativity, using personalization, using interactivity. These are really key. And if we go to this example, we can do a little test with this. It says, you're going to describe a job for other students to guess. First, think of a job that you want to describe. So what are we doing here? We're putting the learners firmly in control. They decide what they want to describe. They have the choice. And then they complete the sentences. And then what do we have after that? A guessing activity. And in fact, this was the inspiration for my little activity at the beginning with 20 questions. So I'm calling this meaningful practice because the language is related to the individual. It's not about fictitious, non-existent people. Another example of an activity like this, and again, we'd have to be in a classroom together to do this, is a variation on find someone who. I'm sure we're familiar with find someone who, where we have to move around the room and students have to ask questions to find the names of people who've done certain things. This is a different way of doing it. In a moment, I will give you 5 statements. What I would like you to do is to write down the names of somebody you know who's done each of these things. Now, we're not actually going to do this one, even though I've said we are. We're not. I'll just describe how it works to you. So you can see that the answers have to be written down in a random fashion on the paper. So the first thing I would say is write down a name of a place where you spend lots of time. So you could write down, for example, my office or my kitchen or the restaurant or the cafe. Another one, a person who's influenced you, so you write down just the name of that person. A thing you can't live without. A place you would love to spend a holiday. The last thing which you bought. You'll see all of these contain relative clauses. Once the students have done this, they show each other their papers with the 5 names on. Then, in pairs, what the students have to do is look at the names on the paper and try and work out which of these statements each name connects with. So for example, on my partner's paper, it might say, for instance, my laptop. And I ask my partner, is this a thing you can't live without? My partner might say, no, it isn't. So I try again. Is this the last thing which you bought? Yes, it is. So what we're doing here is we're doing something called double practice. We're actually reading and writing, and then we're speaking. It's called meaningful practice. And the influence for this, the inspiration for this, has all come from the pages of Roadmap, the course I've been referring to in the session. Okay, so I'd like to move to the third section of this webinar by talking a little bit about putting some of this into context, into practice, into a real communicative situation, and incorporating these all-important soft skills. Now, in this series of webinars, of course, we're talking about teaching students in an environment where English is not the first language. The luxury, of course, of teaching English, for example, if you're in London or New York or Sydney, is that the students can go out into the street and they can practice their English for real in shops, in cafes, on buses, in offices. Of course, in our countries, where I am in Poland, where you are in Russia, English is still widely spoken, but it's not the first language. So this is why I do feel in class we really need to focus quite heavily on this area, trying to simulate real life situations in the classroom. So let's think about this, soft skills. If you meet somebody in the street, let's say we're in Britain now, you might walk up to them, and if it's somebody you know, you might say, hey, how's things? Now, the first thing you'll notice is that that's grammatically incorrect. And yet that's what people say. How are things? How are things sounds too much of a tongue twister for a lot of people. So we make it easier for ourselves. We're lazy. What's the answer to how's things? What do you think it is? What do you think the other person will reply? If you know, pop it in the text chat. What do you think they will say? Brilliant. Good. Yes. Great. All of these things. Yeah. Variations on a theme. We might say fine, thanks. These days, I'm good is very, very common. It's an Americanism that seems to have spread across English. And at first, I used to hate it, but now I use it myself. How's things? I'm good. Remember this, even if you're not very well, even if you're terribly ill, even if you're dying, you're still fine, thanks. Because this is not an inquiry as to your health. Another one, which means exactly the same thing, Brits do this especially, and I did this a little bit right at the beginning of this webinar. Nice weather. What would the response be to this? Agreement or disagreement? I think the response would be agreement, wouldn't it? We tend to agree. If you say, the weather's nice, oh yeah, it's very nice. In fact, it's going to be even nicer tomorrow, although yesterday was a bit wet. So these sort of things mean exactly the same thing. And before we talk about exactly what they do mean in the context of soft skills, let's have one more. I lived in Malaysia for a couple of years, going back some time now, and I'd only been there for a short time when I got into the elevator or the lift in the apartment block where I lived, and a total stranger got in and stood next to me. He turned to me and he said, have you had your lunch? Well, I was totally confused because I thought this guy, this total stranger, was inviting me out. I thought, this is very strange. So I hesitated. And then I said, well, no, I haven't had my lunch. He replied, I've eaten already. What did that mean? Well, I've come to realize since that all of these three things mean exactly the same thing. And what is that? They all mean, do you want to talk to me? So this is what I'm talking about when I'm referring to soft skills. It's not necessarily the language, it's the intention behind it. And the intention behind all of these is to break the ice, to establish some sort of contact before we move on and then communicate. Taking these things literally could be very, very confusing. How's things? Well, I've got a poorly head and my arm hurts and I've got a cold and I went to the doctor yesterday. Well, that might sound like a logical answer, but no, this is not what these things mean. Soft skills are often connected with functional expressions, saying the right thing to the right person in the right way at the right time. A vital soft skill. And these are where functions come in. Functions are fascinating as far as I'm concerned. There are so many ways of achieving each of these areas. So, for example, if we want to apologize, we might say, I'm really sorry. I'm very sorry. I really apologize. Oh, please forgive me. Oh, pardon me. All sorts of different ways, appropriate in different situations, depending upon the setting. Now, teaching functions is fun. I find it fascinating, but there are some good things about it and bad things. Let's start with the good things. It gives students, for a start, real English that they can use to achieve an outcome. Very often, functional expressions can be quite informal. Things like, let me think of an example. Things like, what's up? What's up? Now, it's perfectly decent English as long as students use it in the right context. You might not use it to your boss or to the Queen or somebody you've never met before, but very important that students are able to use these appropriately. It focuses on real outcomes. I often say that grammar is one of those things that you know about, but putting it into practice is where functions come in. Bad things, well, old course books don't always reflect what people actually say. If I show you this list now, let's do a little quiz. All I'd like you to do now is give me a number, 1 or 2, for which you think is the most common. So how do we really communicate? Do we say awesome, number 1, or how amazing, number 2? Anna's straight in there with number 1, and I agree with you. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Awesome is the most popular. Again, another Americanism that's spread throughout all sorts of Englishes. When you say goodbye to somebody, is it number 1 or number 2? Most common these days is actually number 1. Cheerio used to be common, but you tend to say cheers in the same way as when you're having a drink, which sounds a bit strange, but that's the way it tends to be. Now then, what about this one? Number 1 or number 2? And the most common here actually is number 2. The cats and dogs have nearly gone, I'm sorry to say. We don't hear them, we don't see them very much anymore. Very sad, but that's the way it is. What about these? 1 or 2? And the answer is actually number 2, more common. It tends to be rather regional actually, but what a pain is very popular. Okay, what about this one? Number 1 or number 2? I feel like an optician giving an eye test. Number 1 or number 2? Which is clearer. Okay, and number 1, yeah. How do you do was very good. I used to like that because the response to how do you do was exactly the same as the statement. How do you do? How do you do? These days, of course, we don't use it all that much. It tends to be very archaic and very formal. Okay, what about this one? Yep, again, lots of number 1s. It's particularly common in terms of social media these days, things on Twitter and Facebook and so on. And finally, number 1 or number 2? Yep, absolutely right. You're not going to get a cup of coffee nowadays unless you speak Italian. Have you noticed that? Quite interesting, isn't it? If you go up to a coffee stall and say, coffee with milk, sometimes they look at you in a very puzzled way and say, oh, do you mean latte or do you mean cappuccino? So, yeah, it's a good example, isn't it, of changing language, how Italian has actually taken over the world of coffee. So it's not just pizza and pasta, it's coffee as well. So the point here is old course books are going to contain old language. New course books are going to contain new language. It can be difficult, though, to source this material. The secret is to use up-to-date stuff. Stuff perhaps not like this. This is a book, I love it, it's another old one. It comes from the 1960s, originally published by Penguin, part of Pearson. Everyday Conversation Exercises in English, book 2. And there's a guy here saying on the front, what would you do if you found a goat in your room? Very everyday, isn't it? And then the response we've got here is, how extraordinary. Now, what are we more likely to say in this situation? Well, I would suggest that how extraordinary is very old-fashioned. Far more common are expressions like these. Wow, that's so cool, that's amazing, really. Now, these would not have appeared in a course book 20, 30 years ago. They really wouldn't. But the fact is, they are used, they are real, and these are things that students are going to encounter out there in the big world around them. But as you can see here, I've presented these as a list. If we say to students, here's a list of expressions. Now have a conversation and use these expressions. Will the students use them? I suggest they won't, simply because it's easier not to. It's easier not to because there's no real reason here for students to do anything with this list. A list that's effective is a list that students interact with in some way. I think it's fair to say that lists don't really work very well in many walks of life. I'm sure many of us here write shopping lists. Have you ever had the situation where you've written your shopping list? You've got 10 items on your list. You've arrived at the supermarket and suddenly realised that you've left your list at home. We've all done that, haven't we? I know we have. So what do? You go around the supermarket, and how many items do you buy? More than 10 or fewer? Usually more. You probably buy 20 items. And then you get home and you compare the 20 items you bought with the items on your list. How many things are the same? Probably 3, 4, if you're lucky. So it suggests to me that in everyday life, lists don't always work very well. And I think it's safe to assume that lists do not work particularly well in class, unless, as I said, they're a list that the students interact with in some way. So if we take a sequence here, let's begin with recognition. So listen and tick the phrases that you hear. So immediately what we're doing here is getting students to interact with the material. And interaction means memory. What do they do next? They listen and then distinguish. And this is important, isn't it? When we're dealing with functional language, the intonation, the pronunciation is very, very key. It changes the meaning. For example, if I said to you, that's amazing, or that's amazing, only the first one really conveys the positive meaning. By changing the intonation, the second one sounded quite sarcastic and insincere. Of course, we need to give students a little bit of control practice. So working in pairs and giving them a chance to actually use some of this material. And then to move it into a productive phase. So tell your partner about an experience, choose a topic, think of your own idea. So there we are, we've got flexibility. Either select from a list or use your own creativity. Something I often find very useful to do with learners is actually to give them a little personalised demonstration. I'm going to do that with you now, just very, very quickly. I'm going to tell you a little story about something absolutely true that happened at the end of May when I was in Russia. What I would do with the students here is ask them to respond. Now, I'm not going to ask you to respond because through the webinar it's a little bit unnatural, but a story like this can motivate and encourage students to show interest and then get them to start to use the language. All right, so here's my little story. It's absolutely true. I left my home in Wrocław to travel to Russia. It was around about the 25th of May, I seem to remember. I got to the airport, checked in, and I flew to my first stop-off point, which was Warsaw. Now, unfortunately, what happened in Warsaw was that the onward flight to Moscow Sheremetyevo was badly delayed. So my students might be saying now, that's awful. Really? Oh no. Yeah, there was a terrible delay of 2 hours. Anyway, I continued to Sheremetyevo. I arrived at Sheremetyevo, and you know, if you transfer from one terminal to another in Sheremetyevo, it takes a long time. So my students might be saying to me now, what did you do next? What happened next? Okay, I ran from one terminal to the other, and I just got to the correct terminal on time for my onward flight to Saratov. I was out of breath, got to the check-in, got to the plane, sat down and relaxed. Phew. My students might be then saying, really? What happened next? What did you do? Anyway, arrived in Saratov, and as I got to the baggage reclaim, everybody else's bag arrived, but not mine. I was without my luggage. I was standing up in a pair of jeans, a linen shirt, a pair of trainers, and a baseball hat. That was virtually all I had to wear. The woman at Saratov Airport didn't seem very optimistic. She said, oh, we'll try and find your luggage. Try, she said. Anyway, I got to the hotel and checked in, and then in the evening with the team from Saratov, we went to a restaurant, and things only got worse. What happened next? I ordered a beer, and as the beer arrived, the waitress also brought the soup that I'd ordered. And what did she do? She knocked the beer over, and it went all the way down the front of my clothes. My shirt, my jeans, my trainers soaked in beer. They were the only clothes I had. So again, my students at this stage might be responding, hopefully by saying, that's awful. Really? Oh no, what happened next? Well, I sat there soaking in beer, and then the waiter was very concerned, and she got the manager, and the manager came and he apologized and he apologized, and he said, look, I can help you. He said, give me your clothes and I will get them cleaned for you. I thought, now that's a very interesting idea. Does he want me to stay sitting naked in the restaurant while he cleans my clothes? Anyway, naturally enough, I didn't give my clothes. What I did was went back to the hotel, slept, and fortunately, what happened in the end? My luggage arrived the next morning. So little personalized stories like this, and that's absolutely true, little personalized stories like this can actually help enormously. They're motivating. Students have an interest in that person at the front of the classroom. And I'm not saying for a second we should give away all our innermost secrets, but let's share with them experiences, ideas. Let's share with them things that can contribute to the linguistic aims of the lesson. So we've had a look there at some soft skills, showing interest, reacting, encouraging someone to continue. And you'll notice we've moved away from pure grammar. A lot of these are not particularly grammatical, but they're natural, they're real, and they're extremely important. Also important is getting students to think. Getting students to think about how well they've achieved what they've achieved. Now, you'll know that there's quite a disjunct, or a disconnect, if you like, between teaching and learning. I taught Stripe how to whistle. I don't hear him whistling. I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. Teaching and learning are not always the same thing. So giving students the opportunity to reflect, to think, to employ critical thinking skills is a great way to get them to take a little bit of control over their own learning. Check and reflect basically links the beginning of our unit to the end. I can describe a job. I don't say to the student simply tick. I give them the opportunity to actually demonstrate that they can do this. So linking goals with achievements, a very key thing, and something that adults are far more able to do than children. It's good practice. It's great for them to take some responsibility. The materials I've been sharing with you, just to finish off today, it's a brand new course. It's an 8-level General English adult course. It's called Roadmap, and it runs all the way from A1 up to C1. When this was being prepared, Pearson asked lots of questions of teachers, and they got lots of interesting answers. For example, this particular teacher was concerned that his students only have 2 hours a week. This teacher was particularly concerned that his students don't need writing skills. So why bother with a book that contains writing skills in the unit? This teacher said that her students have 5 hours English a week. Whereas this teacher, Miss Gaga, said that her students actually need extra reading skills. So I think the first thing we can see is a huge need for flexibility here. And this is what the authors have tried to do with Roadmap. So the unit, and we've looked at some parts of it already, contains the 4 lessons plus check and reflect. That reflects what we might call a fast track route. But there is an extended route. There are 3 additional lessons in the back of the book, 1 on reading, 1 on writing, and 1 on listening. Each of these are standalone lessons, but they connect with the topic and theme and language of the fast track elements of the unit. So the idea here is that you can create a very tailored, very personalized solution for your students. Not many books actually do that. Talking of books, of course, books are only part of the story. Young adults these days, they do read books, I'm sure they do, but I think we'll also find that a lot of young adults in their leisure time at home are doing things online. There's a huge expectation that the internet is everywhere nowadays. In fact, people only notice the internet these days when it's not there. Have you noticed this? It's a bit like the air that we breathe. When it's not there, there's panic, there's trouble. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that the internet's going to replace us as teachers. I think that we are here to stay. I think that classroom study, these interactive ideas we've been talking about in the webinar, are here to stay, to remain. But I think we can use online learning in tandem, in conjunction with this, in a blended context. And the Pearson solution for this is provided through the course book, the audio, the video material, but also the homework materials, which can be the traditional workbook or interactive online practice known as My English Lab. If you'd like to know more about these things, indeed anything I talk about relating to the course materials, I'll give you some contact details at the end. Something else you'll find is a huge resource online. The Pearson English portal contains all the audio, the workbook audio, videos, tests, photocopyables, you name it. All of these are available for the teacher. The appropriate ones are available for the students. And talking of photocopyables, how many photocopyables does an average course book contain per unit? In your experience, let's just see if you're still there. How many photocopyables per unit in an average course book? Yeah, 3 to 4, 2, yeah. With Roadmap, there are actually per unit 9. So there's 90 per level. 10 units in the book, 9 photocopyables. So huge amount of flexibility there. So if you have more time, use the photocopyables. If you have a bit less time, use fewer of them. So huge amount of flexibility in terms of material. And one other thing I'd just like to mention very quickly is the mobile app. This is something that the students have access to. They can download it, and once they have this, they've got extra grammar and extra vocab practice anytime, anywhere. So that's been a little look at our adult classroom. The idea of language learning, language teaching, hard skills, soft skills, all coming together for one important purpose. I just want to, at this stage, go back to something I mentioned earlier. I gave you a list, do you remember, earlier on, of 5 reasons for communication. One of them consisted of a single word. Can you remember what that single word was? So we had solving problems, sharing information, making relationships. What was the one with single word? Anybody remember? Survival. Xenia, well done. Exactly. Just goes to show, doesn't it? A list with a task is a list that will work. So all of these are coming together for one purpose, for communication. And I'd like to finish by attempting to share with you a video. I've not done this before in the webinar. Let's see if it works. This is a work situation. It's actually the Coast Guard. It's the Coast Guard in Germany. And the video clip begins in German, but you'll see very quickly how it changes into English. And it just shows that when we talk about survival, communication does have a very important place, a very important role to play. Let's see if it works.
In meinem Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät, das gibt es. Das Gerät, das Überlebensradar.
Mayday, mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you? Yeah, over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
I hope you managed to hear that okay. So on that very happy note, I'd like to thank you very, very much for being with us today. I've enjoyed it. I hope you found it thought-provoking and possibly useful. If you'd like to know more about the materials, the contacts I've put on the screen there. So for the St. Petersburg region, it's Natalia Ivanova. For the rest of the country, contact Anna Voronina in Moscow. There's her email address. If you, at a later stage, want to contact me for any reason, please feel free. There's my email address at the bottom. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Don't go away, because we have an important part here, the bit that I mentioned at the beginning, and it's going to be the raffle or lottery. So thank you all very much. Spasibo большое. До свидания.